Welcome to the 12th webinar in the COVID-19 Ask the Experts webinar series and the first webinar in our Return to School special series for NASP members only, academic instruction. We want to thank you for being a NASP member, and we hope that you will enjoy this special skills-based webinar series designed to help you take a deeper look at the professional practices important to you. Today's webinar will address academic screening post-COVID-19. This webinar will provide an overview of how school psychologists can best approach academic screening as they prepare over the coming months for the return to school in the fall. I'm Stacy Kalamaros Skalski, and I'm NASP's Director of Professional Policy and Practice, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar today. I also have two of my colleagues listening in today, Kathy Cowan, our Director of Communications, and Shayla Desai, our Director of Educational Practice. And they too might share their thoughts as we progress through this webinar. So stay tuned there. Next slide, please. Okay, the Ask the Experts webinar series is a collection of recorded webinars that are posted on the NASP website. These are designed to help school psychologists and interns and practicum students as they navigate their way through the COVID-19 pandemic and their beginnings of their telehealth service delivery. Each webinar in the main series is free and open to the public, and as I mentioned today, this Return to School special series is just available to you as a NASP member. At the conclusion of each webinar, a discussion thread will be open on the NASP member exchange, and as a follow-up, you may post your questions and continue your discussion there. Each webinar addresses critical questions that are emerging as a result of the need to provide these telehealth services, and that will provide advice and guidance from our experts and also offer suggested strategies and resources. So we hope that you will continue to watch the Ask the Experts webinar series. Next slide, please. Okay, our expert presenter for today is Dr. Amanda VanDerheyden. Amanda is a private consultant and researcher, national trainer, and founder of the Spring Math Program. This is a web-based comprehensive math RTI system. She's the president of Educational Research and Consulting, Inc. in Fairhope, Alabama, and has worked in a number of school districts nationally and internationally. Dr. VanDerheyden has developed models of MTSS and RTI, academic screening, and class-wide intervention. She frequently provides policy advice and serves on a number of boards in education and psychology. Dr. VanDerheyden has published more than 95 scholarly articles and chapters, 7 books, and has given keynote addresses to state school psych associations and State Department of Education in 31 states and also the country of Singapore. Thank you for joining us today, Amanda. We're so happy to have you. Please take us away into academic screening.
All right, thanks for having me. Okay, so silver lining is that we are, from this process, maybe we can update our practices and be even more effective in the ways in which we screen and identify children who are at risk. The great thing about multi-tiered systems of support, in my mind, is that what it's really about is helping all children access effective instructional support. That's the promise of MTSS. When we do it well, we become the instructional allies of teachers to help children have optimal outcomes. So as we go back to school in the fall, we're going to have some post-COVID realities that we cannot avoid. The first one is that there's going to be a higher rate of risk. We know that children will have lost, in most cases, about 25% of their instructional year with face-to-face instruction. Some children may have received some online instruction, but what they experience will be highly variable, and we will not be able to treat that as a stable, meaningful replacement for face-to-face instruction in terms of making decisions about what children need in terms of academic support as they come back to school. So if you had a graph, you really could imagine that you get this little 25% drop off maybe in content mastery for children as they go into the next grade. And, think about, I'm a math researcher. That's my favorite area in which to work. When children have missed 25% of the content going into the next year, math learning builds. So that means they're going to be missing prerequisite understandings that will impact their learning at the next grade level. So we want to seek to minimize that. And part of what we have to do is account for that change in performance with our screening practices so we can continue to be accurate in identifying who needs help. So what I want to do with you today, given that reality, is demystify screening, kind of walk you through where do we get sensitivity and specificity, and how can we maximize sensitivity and specificity in this context of greater risk, which we know we're going to have in the fall. How can we proceed with screening? What are the sort of takeaway, how-to recommendation? Spoiler alert, it's class-wide intervention. How can we use class-wide intervention to contend with the base rate to get better results? So definitely, we do not want systems to come to school and be in a panic about having not had year-end testing from the year before and having not had any spring screening from the year before, and begin to try to overparse what they do have. Because the reality is things have changed, and that is an awful lot of missing data, and people will be sort of feeling a sense of urgency around collecting screening data to characterize where children are. It would be a huge mistake to do that as a single point in time screener and then apply some norm reference criterion like children below the 20th percentile or children below the 40th percentile are eligible for some type of instructional support. That's not going to serve us well because we have a high base rate of risk. So we want to help systems not have paralysis by analysis. We also want to help them avoid resorting to low yield tactics like saying, let's just choose the lowest performing 20% of kids and give them some type of support. Instead, we just want to operate smarter. So we really want to come back to what are our data sources? What does that tell us about the needs in our particular environment? What are the costs and benefits of the various actions we can take? This will inform our tactics, and we need to definitely attend to implementation management. Because, spoiler alert, most interventions fail because they don't actually get implemented, right, with integrity. They don't actually make it to the same room with the child consistently. So if we tend to implementation management, that information feeds into our data sources, and all of this can inform our strategic vision about how to allocate resources, what resources we should be advocating for from school and district leaders. So let's talk specifically today about screening. Let's talk about best practices in screening and the post-COVID implications with a data example. So these happen to be reading data. These are pretty dated now. These come from several years ago, but this is just simply a scatter plot. And on the x-axis is the year-end high-stakes test performance in reading. And on the y-axis would be screening, and this happens to be a curriculum-based measurement probe, so oral reading fluency, words read correctly per minute. And if we know that this is the pass criterion on the year-end test, we can't move this. So this becomes very easy for us to mark with a line, and we know that children who perform below that score on the year-end test have failed the criterion, and children who perform above the line or higher than that threshold have passed the year-end test. And the way we set our screening criterion, we can move that around. And what we're trying to do is maximize the number of correct decisions that we make. So let's take this apart for a second. If we set the criterion here, then children above this line are predicted to pass based on a screening, and children below this line are predicted to fail. And that gives us our correct decisions. So children in this upper right quadrant here are children who were predicted to pass and did pass. So these are correct negative cases when we think about screening accuracy. And children who are in this lower left-hand quadrant are we call correct positives. They were predicted to fail, and in fact, they did fail the year-end screening. So those are all correct decisions, okay? The errors come here. This is typically the kind of error we least want to make, so we try to avoid this type of error in screening. And this is a false negative error. So these are children who were predicted to pass. They scored above our screening line, but they actually failed the year-end test because they're in this quadrant here. And in this quadrant on the bottom right is the false positive errors. And these are children who were predicted to fail. So they scored below the screening criterion, but they actually passed the year-end test, okay? So typically what we do is we move this screening bar to try to maximize the number of correct negatives and correct positives that we can capture. But the nice thing about looking at the data this way is that what you understand is if you gain accuracy in this quadrant, so if you avoid false negatives by making the screening more challenging, so you move this horizontal line up, you're going to create more errors in this category, which these are your false positive errors. If you move it down so that you make more false negatives, you'll make fewer false positives. So there's a direct trade-off between the types of errors you're going to make when you screen. So for example, if we move this bar up, then we will avoid, these would have been false negative errors. They now are not false negative errors, but to get there, we make lots and lots more false positive errors. False positive errors are problematic typically in screening because they burden the system. So these are cases that we say, yep, this child has failed the screening, this child needs intervention. And in fact, the child didn't really need intervention. The child was going to do okay anyway. False negative errors are cases that really we want to avoid, because those are children who truly needed intervention, but they passed our screening. We said, you're going to be fine, there's not a problem. And in fact, they really were at risk to fail the urine test. Precisely in the COVID situation, what we are going to see is an increased likelihood of false negative errors. And I'll show you this in a second. So how do we get to all of these metrics that publishers report to us? It's actually pretty simple. I love this math, and I'm going to try to walk you through it now. So basically, you always have a 4-cell contingency table. There is no 6-cell contingency table for calculating the accuracy analyses that we're accustomed to. So the number of correct negatives goes into this box, and you can see it's the past year-end test and past the screening. Those are our correct negatives. The correct positives go into this box. These are the ones that were predicted to fail. They failed the screener, and in fact, they did fail the year-end test or criterion. Okay, the false positive errors go here, and the number of false negative errors go here. And from those 4 cells, we calculate everything else. So if you want, this is a great slide to just hang on to, return to, come back to. If you ever want to understand what somebody means when they talk about sensitivity or specificity or predictive power, everything we calculate is here. So even when a publisher is using regression analysis to generate predicted cases in these cells, ultimately it works the same way. So whether it's a raw count or it's an estimated count that results from a regression analysis, when we compute sensitivity, we compute it as taking the number of correct positives divided by the number of correct positives plus false negatives. So it would be this column total. These are the real positives. Now, I do want to point one thing out to you. Sensitivity, by definition, pertains and is only ever calculated based on kids who really are going to fail the year-end test. And specificity is only ever computed in the left-hand column. It's based on real negatives. So kids who are always going to pass the year-end test. Now, when you are screening, you don't know in advance which category a kid is going to fall into. So you don't know whether you should really, really be looking at sensitivity to make the decision, or you should really, really be looking at specificity. So that is the limitation of sensitivity and specificity, and that's why they are always presented in tandem. And in fact, many of the publishers and many of the folks who do this research will choose a balance between sensitivity and specificity, and that would be their place where they set their threshold scores, where they can get a similar amount of sensitivity and specificity, so they look for a balance. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't, but what the case I want to make to you is that if you begin to look at things like likelihood ratios and negative and positive post-test probabilities, which I'm going to talk about in a second, now you're considering information from both categories. And to me, that's really necessary when you're talking about selecting a screening, because you do not know in advance if a child is going to fail or pass your criterion. That's why you screen. Okay, so if you want to play with the numbers, you can always come back to the slide, and now you know how to calculate everything that we talk about. So when we talk about prevalence and base rate, the prevalence and the base rate, which is provided right here, sometimes this is called the pretest probability, that is simply the number of real positives divided by the number of real positives plus real negatives. So that means this is your real positives is your column total over here, and your total number of cases is your denominator. Makes sense, right? So base rate for risk would be maybe the percentage of students who fail the year-end test in the school in which you're working. Okay, Now, let me show you why this matters for us in terms of prevalence. So when we look at sensitivity and specificity, this can be modeled across base rate of risk, prevalence, pretest probabilities. Those names all mean the same thing. We get multiple names just to confuse people. But it goes like this. This is how it works. So you can see there's a systematic relationship between this value called negative post-test probability and the accuracy of the test. So hold on, let me tell you how what this means. Negative post-test probability is the probability that I'm going to fail the year-end test when I have passed the screening. And this is what we care about when we're looking at screening data, because we want to use screening data to say, you're okay. You don't need intervention. You're not at risk, okay? So negative post-test probability is the probability that I've passed screening. So what is my probability? I'm going to fail the year-end test. Those are those false negative errors that we're trying to avoid. So what happens is, as you move toward a higher base rate of risk or more prevalent risk in your setting, your likelihood of still being at risk and actually failing the year-end test goes up systematically, even when you have passed the screening. This is why a single point in time screening doesn't work. I added a little line to this earlier on a different presentation. I should have put it here. But the thing I really want to point out is once you get to 50% base rate of risk, so this means 50% of children in your context really are going to fail the year-end test in a content area. Once you approach 50%, then even if you go in and screen, 10% of the kids that you screen and they pass your screener will actually fail the year-end test. So what I would say in my world is, if I love this threshold model, is that that's not useful. If you've got greater than 10% of kids certainly who pass your screener and go on to fail your test, you can no longer use your screener to rule kids out as needing intervention. So there's a threshold model that this actually comes from one of my articles, but I definitely borrowed this concept from medicine and translated this to school psychology. So my advice is, if you are in the range of 0 to 10% negative post-test probability, then you can rule kids out. You don't have to do any further assessment or consideration for intensified instruction or potentially an eligibility evaluation. If you're in the range of 10 to 50% for negative post-test probability, then you should do further assessment. You need to do some follow-up assessment in the form of progress monitoring, maybe some brief intervention trials, and see, which is what we actually recommend, is intervention and monitoring response to intervention. If you are greater than 50%, if you are in the zone, your negative post-test probability is in the zone of greater than 50%, then you should do intervention without further assessment. You should start intervention immediately, because your assessment is more likely to be wrong than right. Now, most of people can relate to this, because when flu season is at its peak and you go in to see your physician, this has probably happened to people who are watching this. Your physician will likely tell you, there is so much flu in our community and you have symptoms. So yes, I could give you our rapid screening test, but if that test comes back negative, it's more likely that the test is wrong than right. Right? Does that make sense? Because you are symptomatic and the base rate is so high in our community. And that's exactly how it works in academic screening. When risk approaches a certain level, 50% or more, your screening becomes useless to rule people out. So you have to presume that intervention is needed, even if they've passed your screening. So this is an example of how you can use class-wide intervention to change the base rate. And you can make a screening that did not function for you. Maybe you like a certain screening and you've been using it for years. The way you make that screening useful again is to address the base rate. And the way you address the base rate is to provide a dosage of intervention. And I like class-wide intervention. We're going to do some sessions in this. I'm going to do a class-wide math intervention session in an upcoming webinar. Matt Burns is going to do a session for class-wide reading intervention. He's done a ton of work in that area. And Tim Runge is going to do a session for class-wide writing intervention. Within a very short period of time, I could speak especially about class-wide math intervention, I'm talking about within 2 to 4 weeks, you can become much more accurate about determining who is really in need of intensified diagnostic assessment plus or minus intensified instruction plus or minus an eligibility evaluation. And you do that by introducing intervention. Let me show you with this example. This came from an article that was in School Psychology Review in 2013. But in this case, this is the very same screener in a context with 41% of children failing the year-end test. It is not useful to rule students out because the negative post-test probability is 19%, meaning so 19% of kids who passed the screener failed the year-end test. That's way too high, so we can't use it to rule anybody out. But when we come in and we run class-wide math intervention, we change the base rate from 41% to 15%. And when we change that base rate, suddenly the very same measure becomes very useful to rule kids out. So it's all about changing that base rate of risk. That's how you change and make a screener become accurate. And you cannot avoid intervention to accomplish that. The only way to change the base rate would be to, well, I guess you could get rid of kids, right? Kick them out of school, change your sample. We don't do that in public ed. That certainly does happen in some schools that are independent schools maybe, where they do have very rigorous policies around academic performance maybe, and they counsel kids out in that. But for us, this is not an option. The only way we're going to be able to change a base rate, and thank God it's not an option, by the way, but the way we change the base rate is to deliver intervention. Okay. Now, you might be tempted. This is a sort of a mistake that many of us make in screening. This is a pitfall. When we don't know how to proceed, and by the way, this only contributes to paralysis by analysis, what do? Inevitably, we go out and collect more screening. So the takeaway that I want to point out for you is adding multiple measures, which are concurrently administered, which yield scores that are highly correlated, which all our measures do. That's how you build a measure, is you correlate it with other existing measures. You do not improve your decision accuracy. And so what this picture is showing you is from a study that Matt Burns and I did a few years ago. And we used this graph from that study in a commentary that we wrote on screening and progress monitoring. I just took MAP scores and CBM scores and put them on a Z-score so they share a common scale. And that's a 2-layer scatter plot of the same kids on both measures. Gets the same information is what it's showing you. You're not getting unique and different information from each measure that's going to help you make different decisions about kids. All you're really doing is costing instructional time. And that's what this picture shows you. So it's not benign to just go out and collect more assessment. In this study that we did and collected the data in Minnesota years ago, we found that children who were in a more frequent screening group across about 7 participating schools, I think we had, and I think these were 4th grade students. Children who were average to higher performing, but were in the higher frequency screening group, that's that dashed line, which we didn't control, we just characterized whether they were or not. They had less growth across 2 consecutive years of year-end reading scores in this state. And only the children at the very, very, very lowest end of the distribution had any benefit from more frequent screening. You might find it interesting to know, like, we did not go back and interview teachers and ask them why. That would have been good. I wish we had done that, to say, well, why did you do more screening, to try to understand what it was about. There were children in this sample who received up to 12 reading screenings in a single year. It's interesting. We did take a look at the data to see if there was a systematic relationship between children who were lower performing, that those children accounted for the more frequent screening, and that was not the case. There was no relationship between a child's performance and their likelihood of being screened more frequently. Yikes, okay? So what this says is there was a lot of variation across teachers, and it appears to be sort of a teacher decision, and many of us have sat in meetings talking about children and data and how to proceed. And if the answer is let's collect more screening information, my recommendation to you is to be very cautious, because we cannot even rule out the potential for harm when we reach a point of diminishing returns and when we are over assessing children, we might actually be doing some harm. Why? Again, we didn't measure that directly, but we could hypothesize that it results in a loss of instructional time. Okay. The other thing is choosing the most efficient assessment possible. So this is a graph that shows from that same data set, if we gave nobody assessment in that, any assessment in that context, 16% of kids were going to fail the year-end test. So we would have missed 16% of kids if we did no assessment. That's kind of our standard for comparison. We want to do better than 16% or we're not really beating chance in that environment. That's a Neal and Rosen 1955 concept, by the way. And so for curriculum-based measurement, for an investment of about 3 minutes of time, and that's what this axis, the x-axis is time, assessment time. And there are other ways to think about cost, but CBM takes about 3 minutes, and we got to about 8% errors. So we made correct decisions about all but 8% of kids in the sample. It's about 700 kids in the sample, give or take. And for DRA, developmental reading assessment, that takes about 30 minutes, and it was identical to CBM in our data set in terms of accurate decisions made about children who were going to predict and did fail the year-end test. And then for the MAP assessment, it takes about 40 minutes, and we did get a gain in accuracy, but only about 2%. So they were right for all but about 6%, whereas the other two were right for all about 8%. But I always say when I present these data, you know, they should be. It should be more accurate. It feels like a baby year-end test. It takes 40 minutes of time, and by the way, it's pretty expensive. So I like the MAP for research. I use it in research, but it is expensive in dollars and it is expensive in time. And this is a way that we don't tend to really think about assessment in our context. So one of the things I want us all to really be focused on as we go back, and Joe Kovaleski said this the other day, I loved it, that it's going to be, in many cases, an all-hands-on-deck environment, that your time is really going to be better spent helping teachers deploy class-wide intervention as a tactic to improve accuracy and to avoid the inefficiencies and the pitfalls of screening that we know schools are prone to. So schools will be prone to give multiple concurrent correlated measures and to have paralysis by analysis, to then sit back and say, well, we're not sure because these data points disagree, so let's wait and see what happens in general education. We'll come back and screen again in a few weeks. And none of that is likely to be efficient, stable, accurate, and useful in making accurate decisions about students and their need for intensified intervention. Okay. Middle bands of risk are really publisher sleight of hands in the screening world, and it all goes back now that you understand that 4-cell contingency table. You only get 4 cells. You can never have 6 cells. So be cautious when you see any measure that has a middle band of risk. You know, the way this works is all the errors in screening, and you might have noticed this in that scatter plot, the errors are always at the threshold. They're always the kids in the middle. So when there is a middle band of risk, what some publishers might do is remove the cases in the middle so that they get their 4 cells and report the accuracies, the sensitivity and specificity and the other values that we talked about based on being above this line, not at risk, or below this line, definitely at risk, and in effect, delete these cases in the middle. What that means for you as a practitioner is you have just inflated the accuracy of the measure. And so when you use it on the front line, it won't perform like the publisher says it should because it's been inflated. Generally, oh, here's a picture that shows you that. So this is a scatter plot. This happens to be MAP screening for the fall and the year-end test in a state. And the red dots are the errors. So remember, these are the false positive errors. These are the false negative errors. These are the correct negatives, and these are the correct positives. The reality is, in many systems, especially as children continue and are enrolled in your school for multiple years, you already know who these children are before you screen, and you already know sometimes who these children are before you screen. And the reason you're screening is to make these decisions about the students in the middle. And actually what happens is if you remove the kids for whom you already knew the answer before you screened, your screening performance will look a little worse, actually. You'll look inaccurate because you take all of these kind of like gimme corrects out of your denominator. Does that make sense? So there's a picture of that. When you take away the really, really high performing kids, the ones I've circled there, you get a pattern that looks like this. And what happens is your false positive error rate will go way up because you've taken all of these kids out of your denominator. Make sense? Okay. There's another picture that shows you. So your false negative rate doesn't change that much, but your false positive rate will look like it has gone up. You'll actually make the same number of raw decision errors approximately, but it's because your denominator is altered, it look like you have a higher false positive rate. Okay, that is showing you the same thing. So class-wide intervention, let's talk about that. The function of class-wide intervention, well, first of all, it's a very efficient way to improve learning for kids. You can touch all kids for the same investment of time. You set it up like a class-wide peer tutoring experience. Last year, we had 40,000 kids experience class-wide math intervention in my tool. It's doable. I mean, we've been doing this work forever. It is not hard to get teachers to do this work. In fact, what we have learned is sometimes we want to tell teachers they can stop doing class-wide intervention, or we want to really get them to focus on individual intervention. They are less likely to do that. They like class-wide intervention because it is so efficient, and teachers, if they are nothing else, they love their students, and they want there's something that they really appreciate about all children having an opportunity to have an instructional boost, and so they love class-wide intervention. It is not hard to get that off the ground, and when I do my training, I'm going to give you a protocol and some materials to try it, so you can hopefully try this out. Don't be afraid to do that. You know, teachers are so masterful about the mechanics of moving and training kids and getting them to get into working pairs and whatever, so they will help you with that. And you can use your expertise in terms of the assessment piece and the data piece and really working side by side with the teacher as a partner. Don't be afraid to try to launch class-wide intervention. It's enormously rewarding. So first, the reason to do it is a very efficient and effective way to raise performance for all students. As a research-based finding, a lot of people have published demonstrating in RCTs very strong gains for kids exposed to class-wide intervention. Then the second reason to do it is a technical reason, is that it improves your decision accuracy about determining risk. So we think of class-wide intervention, the way I approach it is that it's a gate in a decision model. So the first gate is screening for us, and that screening tells us yes or no, you have a class-wide problem. If you do have a class-wide problem, which we define as the 50% of kids in a given class grouping are performing in the risk range, then you have a class-wide problem. If you have a class-wide problem, we say you must have a class-wide intervention. And when we do that, we can track how you grow during class-wide intervention, and we can become much more accurate about identifying the children who are really in need of intensified instruction. Now, this is really important because right now what's happening across the country is we are over-recommending kids for individual intervention. And as a result, the whole effort is diluted. And most kids who really desperately need intensified individualized intervention are not getting it. That's what we saw in the Ballou et al. Study, and that, of course, we see that even in our own data, we run into this. So part of getting individual intervention effectively deployed means being more efficient about how we recommend it and being more accurate about how we recommend it. And when you recommend it when it's not really needed, those are really wasted resources that take away from being able to deliver it where it is needed. So here's a picture of how you can identify who needs more intensified instruction or further assessment. These are actually real data from my system. I just grabbed this little picture, and it shows that over about 3 weeks of time, there's a nice upward trend. This really dark kind of big line that's red right here that's the median for the class. And the way I like to do it, and the way we do it in my approach, is when the median score in the class reaches mastery, the whole class goes up to a new skill. And we progress through a sequence of skills until with the median hitting mastery each time. And then the decision rule that we use to determine who needs additional help in that context is slightly more complicated than this, but basically it's any child who remains in the frustrational range, the at-risk range, when the class median has reached mastery. So mastery for us is above this green line. At risk is below this yellow line. And actually, this all ties right back to the instructional hierarchy. So this is a child who's in the frustrational range of performance. They've not acquired the skill. They've not acquired this understanding. They're going to be in trouble as the work becomes more challenging. The children in between the yellow and the green line are children in the instructional range. So these children are ready for fluency building. If they don't reach this mastery range, which is above this green line, we cannot anticipate or predict or forecast that they're going to retain the skill over time, be able to use the skill to solve novel and more complex problems, and that's what we're after. So very simply, with no PhD in statistics, you can see that this is the child who needs something more: additional assessment, a data team meeting, intensified instruction. Certainly is what we would recommend, and we would say this is the child who needs individual intervention. Let me show you a picture of what that looks like. So here's what you're going to be asked to do when you go back in the fall. You are going to screen, and your classes are going to look like this. Now, I got to tell you, we see this all the time. So like in our approach is to screening is perfectly married to this COVID crisis, because we always check for a base rate issue. That's our first step. And in fact, we're writing the second edition of a book right now, the RTI approach to evaluating SLD. And with Joe Kowaleski as the lead author, we situate class-wide intervention as tier 1.5. It's between tier 1 and it's between tier 2. It's right in the middle. And if you have a picture at screening that looks like this, so every bar is a child's performance, and in this case, almost the entire class is in the risk range, and you've only got 2 that are just at the start of the instructional range. We would call this a class-wide problem, and we would say we cannot say, all right, let's give intervention to the bottom 20% and think that that's going to be accurate. So I went back and pulled the actual data for what happened to these kids. So in our tool, we say you need class-wide intervention. They get class-wide intervention, which is this is how I teach how to do class-wide intervention. This is how I will teach you when I do the webinar. We start with a skill. When the class median reaches mastery, the whole class will go on to the next skill, and that's what's happening with this class. And when we reached mastery with the median for mixed addition and subtraction 0 to 20, this is the first skill in the sequence, our risk rule applies, and we go, okay, well, here are the children who actually need intensified instruction. And the reason I did this exercise for you is because we see this all the time. First of all, it's only 4 children in this context who really needed intensive intervention. You never would have picked those 4 if you didn't have this type of information, right? You probably would have said, well, we can only work with 5 to start, so maybe we'll do a small group and we'll just take the bottom 5. The problem is when score ranges are restricted, as they always are in a high base rate of risk, a class-wide problem, when score ranges are restricted, the scores are technically incapable of separating kids in terms of what they need, right? We know this, but we make this error all the time. So it's an opportunity maybe to update our practice and do things better. You could take this away even in subsequent years and maybe integrate into your screening process a question about, first of all, do I have a base rate issue? If I have a base rate issue, then let me move to some class-wide intervention model to determine continued risk. That would be our recommendation. It's my recommendation, but that's a picture of why it matters, because it helps you pick the right kids. Okay, and here's another sort of data-based study where you can examine that and read about that if you want more information. The link is right there on ResearchGate, so you can get access to it. But basically, the dark black bars are the positive post-test probability, and the dashed bars are the negative post-test probability. We're typically paying much more attention to the negative post-test probabilities, and you can see that the best way to shrink those is to have class-wide intervention be your basis for determining risk. So feeding back to leaders, this is where I always think that school psychologists are the most valuable to schools. We know how to give the principal the data he or she didn't know to ask for but can't live without, right? So we really want to be giving principals feedback on dose of intervention, who's getting what where, what is the growth, and we should be able to demonstrate that our efforts are paying off. Children are growing, These are the percentages of skills mastered across years. This helps us identify where we need to do better work, right? What are the percent gains across years for systems that are using intervention? And here we've even parsed it by dosage. So you can see, and that's great encouragement to a system to say, let's aim for really, the classes that had high dosage had 100% proficiency on an external criterion. So we want high dosage class-wide intervention. We can also look at gains on year-end state tests. Those are always slower to move, so it's really important to provide more sensitive proximal feedback like this. So for example, we really want leaders to know at any given time what actions are underway, what are the results right now, where is support needed, are the proximal sensitive indicators moving in the right direction, what are the barriers that we can troubleshoot. And for teachers, they need immediate, close, and continual contact with the relevant outcome data that matter, which is like you're asking them to be on a diet and never get on a scale. You know, it's really hard to stick to a diet if you never get on a scale. So the scale is something like this. By the way, these are not real data. That's all different fake names. But we want teachers to see growth. That's the name of the game. So we recommend, whether you're doing class-wide intervention, tier 2 or tier 3 intervention, that progress monitoring should occur weekly, and teachers should be getting that feedback in a graph format. And then they should also be getting some sort of slightly distal gain information about the percentage of kids no longer at risk as a result of the efforts that the teacher is making in the classroom. So final questions. My key points are that screening cannot proceed as it has in the past. We have to institute something other than a hands-off waiting period. If we just sort of wait for the core instructional environment to introduce variation into the scores, it will be variable across settings, highly variable. It will be inefficient, and it might not be adequate in many cases. So the third point is to introduce class-wide intervention as rapidly as possible. Don't be afraid of that. That is a very powerful tactic that I really believe all school psychologists should have in their toolkit. And then finally, it's an opportunity to update our practices. We've always had these base rate issues that are unsteady and different across classrooms, and we've always sort of ignored them. So avoid these sort of norm reference cutoffs about we'll give intervention to the lowest 20% or the lowest 40%. It turns out that was not the greatest way to proceed in the land of RTI. We now know better, and we should do better. And the way to do better is to address and assess the base rate up front. If you have a class-wide problem, institute class-wide intervention as your tier 1.5, and then harvest those data to make subsequent decisions. Don't give multiple measures at the same time that don't give you unique information, and pay attention to the data that you do get so that you can act on it. You don't have paralysis by analysis. Make sure that you're only collecting what you need to inform your next action.
Wow, so that is just a ton of information. A couple of considerations I think that are coming up that we're thinking about are, first is, I'm curious about the role of parents in all of this and helping parents understand what you're talking about today. What's our role as school psychologists in engaging parents in the screening process, especially if school doesn't return to normal and we're still seeing this sort of virtual experience happening for kids? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you know, I think it also starts with school psychologists needing to understand really what's in the screening data. So I think sometimes the trend that I've noticed over my career is a lot of the commercial screening devices, their process, their content, and their criteria have become less transparent over time. So there's been a tendency to move away from a direct and easy to interpret score toward composite scores that include things that aren't totally clear. And I always ask, well, what's the content on the measure? And I'm surprised at how often the school psychologist cannot articulate that. So if the school psychologist cannot articulate that, then we can't share that important information with teachers, and we can't share that important information with parents. And I think parents have a right to understand not just, and parents like percentile rank scores because they can understand that. I guess we've trained them to understand that. But at the end of the day, I think what we want to do is we want to be able to convey to parents what is the likelihood, what is the probability of your child experiencing long-term success, given this milestone sampling that we conducted right now in the name of an academic screening. And I do think we need to be much better about being able to articulate for parents whether there's going to be risk and what we intend to do about that next, or whether we can say with great confidence, your child is hitting the milestones. They are likely to retain this skill over time, experience successful future learning as a result of where they are right now.
Okay, I'm going to ask Shayla to unmute herself. She has a couple good questions, I think, too, that I'd like her to ask.
Sure. So, yes, Amanda, I'm just wondering when or if school psychologists and others should be thinking about the possibility of virtual screening, and maybe we're not ready to think about that yet, but any thoughts you might have if we are in a situation where schools aren't reopening in the fall?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm in denial about this or what. It is my deepest, greatest hope that we do not have to enter that land, because even though there are online measures, they were not normed and created in such a way that we ever anticipated parents managing that interaction of the child with a device in a home context. So to use those data in ways that they have just not been validated for raises really significant ethical considerations and questions about validity in my mind, okay? So the first thing I would say is I really hope that does not happen. I hope that we are in a position where we can safely send children back to school and academic screening can occur in the context of face-to-face learning, which I think is really important. If it does become a reality that schools are going to be shut down for a long period of time, maybe not going back to school for the entire first semester, then we're going to have to answer that tough question. And I'll just be honest, I don't think I have an answer for that right now.
Thank you. That's understandable. A similar kind of follow-up question. We could be in a situation where schools do reopen sometime in the fall, but then we experience a second wave of this pandemic and schools have to close for a period of time. So it could be, a number of disruptions in the upcoming school year. And again, maybe this isn't something that we can have an answer to yet, but any just thoughts about how we might think about that kind of situation and how we might use screening and class-wide intervention when there are multiple disruptions to learning?
Yeah, okay, so that I do have an answer for, because I think what it highlights is the need for us to be especially surgically precise and efficient and deliver a high degree of control around the data points that we collect. So in past years, maybe we could have a little sloppiness around the progress monitoring where we really are not controlling the independent variable. It's just sort of like, here's the intervention, give this a shot, we'll come measure the child once every couple weeks. We're not going to be able to be so hands-off because, as you said, there could be a disruption and kids might be out of school. So we're going to need to collect information as rapidly and as efficiently and as in a tightly controlled way as possible, which means much more management by the school psychologist, in my opinion. And this will allow us to make more rapid decisions. So, when I was in graduate school in the 1990s, Joe Witt was my major professor, and we were doing what would later be called RTI, and it was called the STEEP model. And we were able to make decisions from intervention responsiveness in a very short period of time. We used 5 sessions for reading and 9 sessions for math. And based on that, we got very high diagnostic accuracy characteristics around forecasting who would ultimately have a true failed response to intervention, which we characterized a certain way. We published this data in School Psych Review in 2003. So what that always was encouraging to me was about how rapidly you can make a decision is definitely partially, at least partially, dependent upon how tightly controlled the conditions around the data collected are. And so what that means for us going back is let's tightly control the conditions around which we collect those data so we can make faster decisions.
Thanks.
One other question I was thinking of that, in some ways, the bulk of what you're talking about really has high application in elementary school settings. I'm wondering if there are any special considerations you'd have or some tips or suggestions for school psychologists who are predominantly working in secondary school settings, and how to approach screening as we head into to this new wave in the fall.
Yeah, so I'll tell you how we do it. We follow, I take this advice from Mark Shen and Kim Gibbons and others who have written about MTSS at secondary, and I absolutely agree with them that by the time a child is in 9th grade, you really don't have a question mark about whether or not they're at risk. I mean, they've already been tracked into remedial courses, remedial tracks, so you have information, so much rich information about a child that, in fact, for us, when we run MTSS for math, we don't even begin with screening in high school. We always begin with a class-wide intervention model, and then we harvest the data from that to identify who should get intensified instruction. So that's the good news. The good news is if you're in secondary, you're not starting with screening anyway. You're starting with existing information, and you're coming in with an intervention trial. So you could really partner with teachers who are teaching groups of kids who, you know, they have some known risk that you know about. For example, maybe they have failed past tests. So you can come in and say, let's collect some intervention data and use that as the basis to determine whether or not there's continued risk.
Yeah, I think that's, it's great to have you reiterate that as a super important point, that when you do hit those secondary schools, really it's a different ballgame in terms of where you begin with all of this. So.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what's performing really well for us is relative rate of skill mastery. So we can really readily distinguish who is in trouble based on relative rate of skill mastery, given a standard protocol. Talk a little about that. Yeah,
talk a little about that for people.
Well, so, you know, when you use a standard protocol intervention, the wonderful thing about it is it creates a data set. Every independent variable is somewhat standardized. So a standard protocol intervention, which, you know, for me, classified math intervention is a standard protocol intervention. And the way we do it is we include some elements that we know are active ingredients of effective intervention. So, and everybody gets the same thing. So if your particular issue happens to be that you needed more explicit modeling, well, there's explicit modeling included in the intervention. If your particular issue is you needed more opportunities to respond, that's also included in the intervention. So a standard protocol intervention is one that can sort of function like a broadband antibiotic. We don't have to understand what bacteria you have precisely. We don't need a whole lot of upfront diagnostic assessment. We can choose this intervention, this broadband antibiotic that controls for a lot of causes of your being sick, right? And we can see who responds and who doesn't. And the ones who are not successfully responding, then we will collect more diagnostic information and plan a more personalized, dovetailed, customized individual intervention that meets your needs. So when we do standard protocol intervention in the form of class-wide math intervention, we can look at the number of trials that it takes for classes to reach mastery, and we can also look at individual students within that class, and basically the ones who lag, just like in the picture where I showed this is the kid. This kid did not reach mastery, and most of his classmates or her classmates did within the same period of time given the same intervention. And that's what I mean by relative rate of skill mastery. We also use that, by the way, in a class, in a school, to tell us where to go help teachers. Because if we see that class groupings are having a relative to teachers in the same building are having a slower rate of skill mastery, that tells us probably we can help them get better results.
Yeah. Amanda, terrific information today. Certainly a lot of food for thought for people as they head over the summer. Can you advance the slide, please? And we'll look a little bit at some of the resources that we have. As with each of our webinars, we direct you to the NASP COVID-19 Research Center. This has a variety of guidance documents and links to various websites, as well as other materials that can be helpful to you as you do your planning and your work as a school psychologist. We do have a special guidance document that's specific to screening. You can see listed here. For this special series, there will be a special web page where all of this information will be located. So you'll have the initial academic assessments and intervention upon a return to school guidance document that was introduced with the collective introductory webinar to this special series, and then you'll have a special guidance document that goes with each one of these separate webinars. And so again, there is one for screening. And then we refer you also to some of the other materials that have come from some of the other webinars that in combination might be very helpful to you. If you could switch to the next slide, please. We also encourage you to visit these external resources. These websites, they have a lot of information and tools that you can use in responding or crafting your response heading into the fall. And so we encourage you to mine these, and the links are live here. And you will find, if you click to the next one, there are also some references that might be helpful to you that are good reading on this topic and others. And so we encourage you to make those little visits. As we wrap up today, I just want to say thank you to Amanda for her time in putting together these materials and recording this webinar. We just know that your work has been very important to our profession and to the role of school psychologists and our expanded role that we are constantly working to try and implement in schools. And so we really thank you for your time today. I do want to encourage people again to go to the NASP member exchange to continue to ask your questions and to make your comments out there. And remember that the PowerPoints that are attached to this webinar and posted to the website will allow you direct access to the links, so you can just click on them and head right to those websites. Thank you for listening to this webinar today. We look forward to having you visit us again as we continue this Return to School special series. And I wish you all to stay safe and stay healthy in the days ahead.